He was a veteran, freshly discharged after years of service, hoping an abandoned farmhouse buried in the Montana snow would offer nothing more than silence. But on his first morning there, he discovered an elderly woman hiding inside the shed, shaking, exhausted, and clutching a secret so terrifying it could bring down men powerful enough to erase anyone who knew it. She wouldn't explain how she got there. She only whispered that the people chasing her would kill to keep that secret buried. And the way her eyes darted to the tree line told him they were closer than the snow revealed. From that moment, the veteran and his German shepherd were pulled into a storm of lies, corruption, and a truth so dark it had to be carried through the night like a burning ember. What happened next would test everything he thought he had left. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of mystery, courage, and the secrets the snow can't hide. A pale winter sky sagged over the forests of Snow Ridge, Montana, its breath turning every pine branch white as if the whole world had fallen into a long, unbroken sleep. Ethan Cole, 38, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying the exhaustion of a decade of deployments in the lines around his eyes, stepped out of his truck and let the quiet settle on him like a fragile promise. A retired Navy SEAL with a trimmed dark beard and the posture of a man who still scanned every horizon, he had spent the last few years wrestling with the ghosts of things done, orders followed, and comrades lost. Peace had become a theory he couldn't quite touch, but with the last of his savings, he bought this abandoned farmhouse deep in the woods, hoping distance and silence might finally slow the storm inside his mind. Coda hopped out behind him, landing with the soft thud of a practiced guardian. The German shepherd, 4 years old, sable-coated, alert-eyed, moved like a creature born to weather and war. Coda had served alongside Ethan on 2 rescue deployments before the dog was honorably retired after an injury that left a faint scar above his right flank. Though healed now, the experience made him overly protective, almost hyper-aware of anything unfamiliar. Ethan knew this dog better than he knew most people. They shared the same unease with crowds, the same instinct to guard first and rest later. The farmhouse itself was a forgotten relic. 2 stories of weather-worn boards, windows clouded by grime, the porch sagging just enough to creak under Ethan's boots. The place smelled of dust, old timber, and something like memories left too long in a drawer. It wasn't beautiful, not yet, but it felt untouched, unclaimed by anyone but the wind. That, more than anything, was what Ethan needed. A place where nobody knew him. A place where he didn't have to explain why sleep came in fragments, or why silence sometimes pressed harder on his chest than noise ever had. He started his evening by checking each room with the methodical calm drilled into him years ago. The living room showed signs of animals nesting through past winters. The kitchen had a single working cabinet and a counter warped with time. Upstairs, the bedrooms were empty except for peeling wallpaper and a mattress long surrendered to damp and decay. There was a worn dignity to it all, as if the house, like him, had survived storms it never asked for. Night had barely settled when Coda stiffened near the back door. Ethan felt the shift immediately. The tensed shoulders, the low vibration in Coda's chest, the way his ears aligned like arrows toward the darkness outside. Coda didn't react like that without reason. Ethan grabbed his flashlight, clicked it on, and followed the dog through the snow-dusted yard toward the old storage shed. The building was small, crooked at the roofline, and smelled of rusted tools and forgotten summers. The door was cracked open. Ethan felt his heart shift. Gears. Not panic, not fear, but the sharp clarity of training rising to the surface. He pushed the door slowly, letting the light sweep the shadows. That's when he saw her. An elderly woman, perhaps 70, huddled near a stack of empty crates. She was thin, almost fragile, with a frame that looked as though a strong wind might knock her over. A thick wool sweater hung off her shoulders, and her silver hair clung in tangled strands to her pale face. Her cheeks were red from cold, her knuckles raw, and in her arms she clutched a bundle wrapped in cloudy plastic, paper edges poking through as if she'd been holding it too tightly for too long. Her eyes, gray and frantic, met Ethan's beam of light, and instantly she shrank back, shielding the documents with her body. It wasn't the reaction of a trespasser. It was the reaction of someone terrified of losing something more valuable than her own breath. Ethan lowered the flashlight a little, softening his stance. "Ma'am, you're safe. I'm not going to hurt you." The woman swallowed hard, her voice trembling as if each word had to push past layers of fear. "Please, don't let them find me." He noticed then the small details, the way her boots were caked with frozen mud, suggesting she had run a long distance. The tear along her sleeve that looked more like it came from being grabbed than from snagging on a branch. The exhaustion in her posture, as though she had not slept in days. This wasn't random. She hadn't wandered into his property by accident. This was escape, desperate and deliberate. Coda approached quietly, sniffing the air around her. Instead of growling, he sat beside Ethan, tail low but not hostile. Coda trusted fast, but only when someone's fear was real. Ethan took that as the first sign that whatever this woman carried, fear, truth, or both, deserved attention. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. "Eleanor," she whispered, gripping the plastic-wrapped papers so tightly her hands shook. "Eleanor Brooks." The name meant nothing to him, but the way she said it, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to exist anymore, told him everything he needed to know. "Eleanor," Ethan repeated, stepping closer with slow, measured calm. "Why are you here?" She hesitated, breathing unevenly, eyes flicking toward the dark forest behind the shed. "Because they're looking for me, and for this. And if they find either, I won't live long enough to explain." Ethan felt the cold prick at the back of his neck, not from the weather, but from the certainty in her voice. The documents weren't simple papers. They were the kind of thing someone would run into a blizzard to protect, the kind of thing that could make people kill. Coda growled softly toward the trees. Ethan's jaw tightened, and in that moment he understood one thing clearly. Whatever war he had hoped to leave behind, something just dragged him into a new one. The storm outside had thickened, turning the windows of the farmhouse into frosted mirrors that reflected the warm kitchen light in drifting, ghostly shapes. Ethan settled Eleanor at the small wooden table, its surface scarred from years of neglect. He placed a worn wool blanket around her shoulders while Coda lay at her feet, his ears relaxed but not entirely at ease. Muscles coiled beneath his thick sable coat like a silent promise of protection. Eleanor's breaths came shallow, uneven, a mixture of cold and the lingering shock that clung to her like a second skin. Ethan turned the kettle on, its slow hum grounding him. For a few seconds, neither spoke. He wanted her to breathe, to steady herself. But even in the quiet, he could feel her tension cracking the air. Her fingers never loosened around the plastic-wrapped stack of documents. She held them the way a drowning person holds onto the last piece of driftwood. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who had coaxed truth out of people in far darker rooms. "Eleanor, who's after you?" She hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen doorway as if expecting shadows to leak through it. The bare bulb above them cast long, trembling lines across her face, highlighting how deep exhaustion had etched itself into her features. At last, she whispered, "They'll come. They always do." Ethan leaned forward, his brows tightening. "Who?" Her eyes lifted to meet his, and for the first time, he saw the steel beneath her fear. Eleanor Brooks was not simply a victim. She was a woman who had fought her whole life, someone who had survived loss, hardship, and the slow erosion of trust that comes from decades of living beneath powerful men who believe they own the world. "Gavin Rhodes," she said, the name leaving her lips like a bitter taste. Even Coda's ears twitched at the tension in her voice. Ethan had heard the name before. Anyone living within 100 miles of Snow Ridge had. Gavin Rhodes, the so-called real estate visionary of Montana. A man in his mid-50s with an immaculate appearance. Silver-streaked hair, gelled back, angular jaw, always clean-shaven. Tailored suits that disguised a body hardened not by honor, but by a lifetime of climbing over others. Charming in public, ruthless in private. There were rumors, forced buyouts, quiet threats, people moving out overnight after refusing him, but nothing proven. Until now, Ethan suspected. "He wants your land," Ethan said, watching the way her fingers tightened around the documents. "He wants everything," Eleanor replied. "But my farm, my family's farm, it's the last piece he needs for a project he's laundering money through. A development worth tens of millions." Her voice trembled, not from fear of losing the land, but from what she had stumbled upon. "How did you get those papers?" Ethan asked. Eleanor exhaled shakily, her shoulders curling inward. Her voice lowered, as though speaking louder might summon the men she feared. "A mistake," she said. "One of Rhodes's men left a briefcase in my barn. Maybe he thought no one lived there anymore. Maybe he wasn't thinking clearly. I found it the next morning." Ethan studied her, noting the subtle strength beneath her frailty. Eleanor Brooks had the look of a woman who had spent her youth working fields, strong hands, wiry arms, the posture of someone who had endured Montana winters long before this one. But age and fear had trimmed away her resilience. Tonight she looked small, breakable, like an old branch threatened by all the storms she'd survived. "Inside the briefcase," she continued, "I found records of shell companies, fake transactions, bank transfers, bribes. Names of officials I thought were honest. Rhodes built his empire on lies, and those papers prove it." Her voice cracked. I truly thought turning them in would make everything right." Ethan remembered the vests of men posted in desert villages, the wide eyes of frightened civilians, the cold logic of power. People like Rhodes didn't fear the law. They feared exposure. "And tonight?" he asked. "They came," she whispered. "3 of them. I heard their voices in my yard, saw their flashlights through the cracks in my barn wall." Her hands trembled so violently she had to steady them against the table. "They called my name. They said they only wanted to talk. But I heard the guns." She swallowed, shaking her head. "I ran. I didn't look back." The kettle clicked off, the soft sound oddly intimate in the middle of her terror. Ethan poured her a cup and slid it gently toward her. The moment her hands wrapped around the warm ceramic, some of the shaking eased, though the fear in her eyes stayed sharp. He stood and walked toward the back door. Coda followed, tail low, and together they stepped out into the biting night. The cold cut across Ethan's skin, but what chilled him deeper was the sight on the snow. Not just Eleanor's footprints, faint and staggered from exhaustion, but 3 other sets, heavier, spaced with the purposeful stride of trained men. And near the shed wall, half buried by wind-blown frost, lay a spent shell casing glinting like a small warning. He crouched, lifting it between his fingers. Fresh. Fired hours ago at most. Someone had fired at Eleanor. Someone had tried to silence her. He felt something shift inside him. A protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. Something old and sharp, rising from the ashes of things he'd buried when he left the service. The war he thought he'd escaped was knocking again, not with ideology or foreign flags, but with greed. Raw, violent, local. When he stepped back inside, Eleanor watched his face closely, searching it for hope or doom. Ethan laid the casing on the table between them. "They're close," he said quietly. Eleanor's eyes filled with dread, her knuckles whitening around. The documents. Winter outside was brutal, but nothing compared to the men still hunting her. And Ethan knew that from this moment on, Snow Ridge would not stay silent for long. Night settled over Snow Ridge with a heavy, suffocating quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't soothe, but instead hinted that something was listening from the trees. The farmhouse, once an empty shell, had become an accidental fortress, a place where fear and uncertainty now lived alongside 2 people who had never intended to cross paths. Ethan Cole moved through the rooms with the steady precision of a man who understood danger better than he understood peace. His tall frame, muscular but worn, seemed to absorb every flicker of shadow as he tightened wires, fastened bells to thin metal strings, and positioned tin cans near windowsills so even the softest movement outside would announce itself. These makeshift alarms were crude compared to the gear he once used as a Navy SEAL, but effective enough for what he anticipated would come. He hadn't expected to use combat instincts again after retirement. Yet here he was, hands steady, breath even, mind sharp in a way it hadn't been for months. Coda patrolled the perimeter inside and out with the seriousness of a seasoned soldier. The German shepherd, 4 years old and built with strong shoulders and a broad chest, moved with disciplined elegance. His coat, dark sable with lighter amber streaks, bristled each time the wind pushed against the house. The faint scar near his flank, barely visible under the fur, was a reminder of the mission that ended his service, but not his loyalty. Coda sniffed every corner, listening for sounds Ethan couldn't catch. He paused often, head raised, tail stiff, absorbing the cold wind as if trying to read messages carried through the storm. In the living room, Eleanor Brooks warmed her hands near the small wood-burning stove, her thin figure wrapped in Ethan's old wool blanket. At 70, she had the fragile look of someone who had spent decades working outdoors, weathering summers that cracked the soil and winters that crept into the bones. Her silver hair, tied loosely at the back, framed a face lined with hardship, creases that didn't merely show age but also years of stubbornness, grit, and a refusal to surrender. She watched Ethan move, her eyes following him with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "You shouldn't be doing all this for me," she murmured, her voice hoarse but steady. "I never meant to bring trouble into your home." Ethan paused, adjusting a line of metal cans near the back window, then turned toward her. "Trouble came looking for you," he said quietly, "and you ran where your feet could take you. That doesn't make any of this your fault." Eleanor looked away, fingers gripping the blanket as if it could anchor her trembling spirit. Rhodes doesn't forgive, and he certainly doesn't forget. I spent years refusing to sell him my land. First it was polite letters, then lawyers, then uglier things. Her voice softened, breaking. I thought if I kept my head down, if I didn't make noise, he'd move on. Ethan studied her carefully. Beneath her frail posture, he saw a woman who had endured far more than she ever spoke aloud. "What did he do?" Eleanor shut her eyes, inhaling as though each memory cut deeper than the last. "He sent a lawyer first, a young man named Jared Kane. Tall, sharp jawline, dark hair slicked back, the type who believed his suit made him invincible. Charming at first, then cold. Told me the land wasn't worth much, offered me pennies for it. When I said no, he came back angrier. I saw the shift in him, the entitlement, the threat hiding behind a practiced smile." She opened her eyes again, staring at the stove's flickering flame. "A week later, someone cut my fence. A few days after that, I woke up to find 2 hunting hounds roaming my yard, teeth bared. They cornered my old goat. Poor creature didn't stand a chance. I found him the next morning. That was the first time I knew Rhodes wasn't just trying to buy my land. He was trying to break me." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not pity. He had seen too much cruelty to reduce anyone's suffering to pity. What he felt was recognition. The world had taught him again and again that good people often paid the highest price for simply standing their ground. "And when that didn't work?" he asked. Eleanor exhaled shakily. "He sent men, not many, 2 or 3, big, rough, the type you don't forget once you see them. One of them, a bald man with a jagged scar across his jaw, told me accidents happen to people who make life difficult. I started sleeping with the lights on after that." Her voice dimmed. "And now that he knows I have evidence, he'll do whatever it takes." Outside, the wind howled, dragging loose snow against the walls like claws searching for entry. The storm was growing stronger. Ethan checked the windows again, feeling the electricity flicker overhead. The farmhouse lights blinked once, twice, then steadied, though the threat of darkness loomed with each gust. Eleanor watched him, her eyes reflecting the storm's chaos. "I brought danger into your house," she whispered. "You didn't ask for any of this." Ethan studied her for a long moment. The scars of her life were different from his, but the shadow they cast was the same. Loneliness, fear, a quiet desperation not to be forgotten by the world. "I've spent a long time trying to outrun my past," Ethan said finally, his voice carrying a tired honesty. "But hiding never solved a damn thing. Sometimes trouble finds you because you're the one meant to face it." Coda returned from the hallway, ears perked toward the window, growling softly at the wind, or something deeper beyond it. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's head, steadying him, and for the first time since Eleanor had arrived, he felt a sense of clarity cutting through the unease. He turned back to the elderly woman trembling beside the fire. "You're not running anymore, he said. "Not while you're here." Eleanor's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. She saw it, the resolve in him, the shift from reluctant host to guardian. A man who had fought more battles than he wished to remember was about to step into one more. And though the storm outside raged louder for the first time that night, she felt a glimmer of safety. Ethan straightened, his voice quiet but unshakable. "I'll protect you," he said, "at any cost." The storm reached its peak just before dawn, swallowing the forest in a heavy veil of white. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, carried sideways by a wind that howled like something wounded. The old farmhouse shook under each blast, its wooden frame groaning as if remembering winters far more merciful than this one. Ethan Cole stood by the front window, the room lit only by the soft red glow of the dying fire. His broad shoulders were tense, posture coiled with readiness. Years of combat had carved a quiet instinct into him, an awareness that danger never announced itself with noise, but with a shift in the air, a tremor of intention. And tonight, that tremor was unmistakable. Coda sensed it first. The 4-year-old German shepherd froze at the living room archway, ears pinned forward, body rigid like a statue carved from tension. His amber eyes fixed on something unseen beyond the trees. Then he released a low growl, deep, primal, vibrating through the wooden floorboards. Ethan followed his gaze, and seconds later, through the swirling white curtain outside, he saw them. 3 black SUVs moving slowly along the forest path. Their headlights dimmed, almost swallowed by the snow, yet their silhouettes were clear enough. Muscular, angular vehicles, the type driven by men who didn't want to be questioned. They stopped nearly simultaneously, like a choreographed movement. The engines quieted. The forest held its breath. Ethan stepped away from the window, his mind shifting into the calm, deadly stillness he once carried on missions. He moved through the house, extinguishing the few remaining lights until the farmhouse sank into darkness so complete it felt underwater. Only the faint embers in the fireplace remained, pulsing like a dying heart. Eleanor Brooks stood behind him, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. The 70-year-old woman looked even smaller in the dim light, thin shoulders hunched beneath the blanket, silver hair messy from hours of anxiety. Her face was pale, but her eyes carried something stronger than fear tonight: defiance. She had run far, suffered much, and the documents she clutched were no longer just evidence. They were her final stand against the man who tried to erase her. Outside, the car doors opened. Shadows stepped out into the storm. The first man to reach the porch was tall and heavy-set, wearing a thick black jacket stretched across a chest built like a wall. His bald head gleamed beneath the snowfall, and a deep scar cut across his jawline, an unmistakable mark that branded him as dangerous before he even reached the door. Behind him came 2 more men, slightly slimmer but no less threatening. One had a trimmed beard and restless eyes, darting across the yard as though expecting ghosts. The other carried himself with the cold efficiency of someone used to violence. Flashlights in gloved hands swept across the snowdrifts. Silencers were already mounted on their pistols. Then came the 4th man, Gavin Rhodes himself. Rhodes was in his mid-50s, tall, composed, with silver-streaked hair slicked back despite the storm. His tailored coat looked absurdly expensive for the weather, but Rhodes was the type of man who believed danger bent to him, not the other way around. His face, angular and clean-shaven, held a smug calm that suggested he had already decided how this morning would end. He looked like someone who had built an empire not with skill, but with intimidation, and expected the world to obey. Ethan's makeshift traps were the first to break that illusion. As one of the henchmen circled around the back, a subtle metallic rattle echoed across the yard. The trip line. The man paused, confused, just long enough for Coda to charge through the back door, launching himself from the porch in a blur of black and gold. The dog struck with controlled force, knocking the man into the snow. A muffled shout erupted, cut short by Coda's growl and the thud of bodies struggling in the white chaos. Another man, startled, pushed into the living room from the side door. Ethan met him instantly. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion, just a swift, practiced sequence of grabs and locks perfected through years of SEAL training. Ethan seized the attacker's wrist, pivoted, and slammed him to the floor, disarming him with a fluid, efficient movement. The man hit the ground hard enough to rattle the nearby shelves. The house was alive with impact. Scuffling boots, muffled cries, the metallic clink of alarms echoing from the porch. Snow blew through the cracked doorway like smoke. Then Rhodes entered the threshold. His voice cut through the chaos, calm and cold. "You took something that doesn't belong to you, Eleanor," he called into the room. "Tonight is the last time I ask for it." Eleanor stepped out from behind Ethan, her voice raspy but unshaken. "The only thing that doesn't belong," she said, "is your greed on my land, and I will not bow to you." Rhodes smirked, raising his hand to signal his remaining man, but before anything else could unfold, the distant wail of sirens sliced through the storm. Ethan's old military emergency transmitter, activated hours earlier, had finally reached a ranger station. Red and blue lights flickered between the trees like salvation breaking through the blizzard. Officers stormed the yard, shouting commands, weapons raised. Rhodes and his men froze, cornered on all sides. Within minutes, the tycoon who once controlled half of Montana's land was forced to kneel in the snow. Ethan guided Eleanor through the doorway, leading her onto the porch where the first light of dawn broke across the storm's fading edge. She looked at him, relief and disbelief mingling in her tired eyes. The longest night was finally over. A week after the blizzard and the long night that nearly cost them everything, Snow Ridge woke beneath a calmer winter sky. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and glittering beneath the morning sun. In town, newspapers sold out faster than bread. Every headline carried the same story: the largest land corruption scandal Montana had seen in decades, a revelation that shook county officials, investors, and half the state's political offices. Gavin Rhodes, once a man whose wealth and charm had shaped the valley, was now plastered across front pages with wrists cuffed and expression hollow. The truth he had buried for years finally surfaced, dragged into the light by an elderly woman no one had ever expected to defy him. Eleanor Brooks became the name on everyone's lips, but for her, fame meant nothing, not now. In the farmhouse kitchen, Eleanor sat at the small wooden table wrapped in a soft plaid shawl that Ethan had found in a storage trunk upstairs. The shawl brought a bit of color back to her thin shoulders and made her look less like a fugitive and more like the strong, weathered matriarch she was. A week of peace had returned some warmth to her cheeks, though the lines of worry still lingered around her gray eyes, lines carved by years of resisting Rhodes's intimidation and by the fear that one wrong step would erase her and everything she loved. Across the room, Ethan Cole poured coffee into two mismatched mugs. He had shaved that morning, something he hadn't bothered with in months. The mirror hadn't shown a different man, not exactly, but a lighter one. Someone carrying a weight that no longer pressed quite so hard on his chest. His tall, muscular frame moved less like an ex-soldier waiting for the next strike and more like a man learning how to breathe again. Retirement had always felt like an unfinished sentence, but the past week, protecting Eleanor, standing up to Rhodes, had given him something he didn't expect: purpose without violence, direction without orders. Coda lay near the stove, stretched out on a folded quilt as if he were royalty. The German Shepherd had become the unofficial hero of Snow Ridge. People in town, truck drivers, grocery clerks, ranchers, had come by with gifts: biscuits, chew toys, even a tiny handcrafted leather collar made by a retired saddlemaker named Henry Walsh, a wiry old man with sun-beaten skin and hands rough as oak bark. Coda accepted all offerings with the solemn dignity of a soldier receiving medals, though Ethan suspected the dog enjoyed the attention far more than he let on. Eleanor took a careful sip of her coffee, savoring the warmth. "It feels strange," she said quietly, her voice steady but thoughtful. "Having silence again, but this time it's not the kind that scares me." She glanced toward the window, where soft sunlight spilled across the snow-dusted porch. "For so long, I kept thinking someone was watching from the tree line. Tonight might be the first night I'll sleep without checking the locks twice." Ethan sat across from her, his expression gentle. "You're safe here, for as long as you need." Her fingers tightened slightly around the mug. I never thought I'd hear those words again. Though Eleanor had always carried herself with stubborn resilience, the past week had peeled back layers of loneliness she never spoke about. For years, she had lived by herself on her family's land, tending the property alone, fighting Rhodes quietly while the town moved on without noticing the storm in her life. She had been a forgotten piece of Snow Ridge, until now. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Ethan stood, instinct still sharpening his movements, until he recognized the silhouette behind the frosted glass. Deputy Sam Turner, a stocky man in his 40s with sandy hair, perpetually tired eyes, and a deep, reassuring baritone, entered with a polite nod. He had been one of the first officers on the scene during Rhodes's arrest. His broad face was kind, but carried a heaviness from decades of dealing with the worst parts of humanity. Today, however, his expression held something gentler. "Morning, folks," he said, stamping snow off his boots. "Just came by to let you know the state's arranged full protection for Mrs. Brooks. She's officially under witness security for the next phase of the investigation." His gaze softened when he looked at Eleanor. "You did a brave thing, ma'am. The whole county owes you. Eleanor bowed her head slightly, humility softening her features. I didn't do anything brave. I just told the truth. Deputy Turner smiled faintly. Sometimes that's the bravest thing of all. After he left, Eleanor remained quiet for a long moment, watching snowflakes drift past the window like slow-moving embers. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost fragile. Ethan, when I ran into your shed that night, I thought it would be the last place I ever entered. She looked at him with an expression full of gratitude, relief, and something deeper, connection. But it became a place where I'm alive, where I'm seen. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle warmly inside him. This house was empty for a long time, he said. Maybe it was waiting for us. And in that moment, it felt true. The farmhouse that once echoed with hollow wind now carried the scent of coffee, the warmth of fire, and the quiet companionship of two souls who had been wandering for far too long. Later that afternoon, sunlight broke fully through the clouds, painting the Montana sky in gold. Ethan stepped onto the porch with Eleanor beside him and Coda trotting proudly at their feet. The world no longer felt hostile or haunted, but hopeful. A new chapter, born not from violence but from courage, truth, and the unexpected ties formed in the coldest winter. Together, they faced the bright horizon, a home, rebuilt, from ruin and warm enough to outlast any storm. And in the quiet, after the storm, one truth remained. Miracles don't always arrive with thunder or shining wings. Sometimes they come in the shape of a tired veteran searching for peace, or an elderly woman who refuses to surrender, or a loyal German shepherd who stands his ground when darkness closes in. Some call it luck, some call it fate. But those who have walked through enough winters know it is God who places the right people in our path at the right time. He does not always lift us out of the storm, but he sends someone to hold the light so we can find the way through. And just like Ethan and Eleanor, we all face battles the world will never see. Some days we stand strong, some days we're the ones who need to be carried. But grace, courage, and compassion, those small sparks, can still shake the walls of injustice, heal old wounds, and rebuild a home where hope once froze. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you, no winter lasts forever, and no soul is ever too lost for God to reach. May he watch over you, protect your family, and guide you through whatever storm you're walking in right now. Before you go, share this story with someone who needs a little light today. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles that still walk beside us. Even in the coldest nights, God bless you and your loved ones.